Right, good evening. Welcome to the Institute for Government. Many thanks for coming. My name is Peter Thomas. I'm a director at the Institute. I run our work on civil service reform, capability performance, and our partnership with the Big Lottery. Bit of housekeeping and health and safety announcements. We'll finish by 7:30 at the latest, and we'll have drinks and canapes from our legendary hospitality on the landing. Event is on the record. There are a few journalists around, so bear that in mind. Tweeting most welcome, hashtag BigIFG, which I think has a great ring to it. So that's the boring stuff. So the point of the evening, we want to share with you progress from what for us is quite a new venture at the Institute. It's a partnership with the Big Lottery, inspired by Big Lottery's really quite striking investment in some of the toughest and enduring sort of social policy challenges which many of you in the room have wrestled with for your entire careers and maybe not quite finished yet. So a really exciting, different kind of investments, which Nat will talk a bit more about in a moment. But for the Institute, we've got a passion and a real long-standing interest in how to make policy better. Policy clearly isn't working well enough, or we'd have fixed these issues by now. So how do you make it better? And a strong strand within that, how do you look differently at government from a different angle? It's very easy here for the Institute to get a little bit SW1 oriented. But for us, the opportunity of this programme was to look very differently through different people's eyes on projects right around the country. What does government look like when you look at it from another angle? So for us, that's a real challenge to how we think at the Institute. So this core idea of the programme was to bring together senior policies in government and connect them with these really quite remarkable opportunity to see long-term investments trying to work differently and better on these really tough social policy issues. So structure's quite straightforward. Nat Sloane is going to speak first. I'll introduce him in a moment, but talking from a Big Lottery angle. Then you'll hear from a couple of people who've been right at the heart of the programme, who will talk to you about what they've done and what they've found and what it's been like. And then Nicola Hughes, who's managed the programme, will take you through the sort of core insights and some of the findings we have had through this programme and the interaction with these projects. We'll have a short gap after each input so you can just get some clarifications or questions that are on the top of your head, and then we'll have a longer opportunity for Q&A towards the end. So, moving on, I'm very pleased to have Nat Sloane with us. He's chair of Big Lottery England and has been since 2011. Background in business, co-founder of the Impetus Trust, which was the first venture philanthropy trust fund in the UK, so a very interesting and distinctive perspective. So, Nat, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand up and walk around a little bit because I didn't want to get boxed in, if that's all right. First of all, I'm delighted to be here to commemorate the first year of the partnership between Big Lottery and IFG, and to congratulate the people here who've been involved in this collaboration. It's a great milestone. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what we're doing in Big Lottery within England to set it in context as to how the activities that you've been involved with, where they sit. The Lottery Fund in England, we are responsible for distributing, we have the privilege of distributing about £550 million a year, give or take, depending on lottery ticket sales. A key part of the program for Big in England is our open programs, the small, medium-sized grants that are spread all around the country. They are invaluable both because of the responsibility we have as a lottery distributor and as a source of real learning for grassroots activities. So the open program's about half of what we do. The other half, roughly, is we decided to focus on a small number of strategic initiatives. There are 5 in total. The 5th was announced yesterday by Dharmendra at the Amy Winehouse Foundation Ball, which was fairly cool, I have to tell you. And they run the gamut from 0 to 3-year-olds right up to older age. But the consistent and common themes around the strategic initiatives are they are trying to shift the dial, the policy dial in the long run, on some tough social problems. And the characteristics would be they are programs that will run for several years, so a minimum of 5, 10 years plus. We are committing material sums of money by big lottery standards, anywhere between 100 and 200 million pounds per initiative. They are very strongly and purposefully informed by people at the local level, users, beneficiaries, clients, however we want to describe them, because we have a very strong view that's underpinned by our strategy around people-powered change, that people in communities are assets and have very good ideas about what can work and should work, and they need to be actively involved. So each of these initiatives very much informed by local users, long-term, significant chunks of money, and most importantly, or as importantly, they are going to be independently and robustly evaluated all along the way, and the learning of what is working and what is not working will be shared among the participants in the initiatives and more widely. And the last element, and I think the element that really links into connecting policy with practice, is that in every single initiative, the key element is around building cross-sectoral partnerships. So in 4 of the initiatives, they're led by voluntary and community sector organizations, but it's absolutely crucial that public sector players are deeply involved. In some of them, getting the private sector involved is crucial. In the initiative we launched yesterday, the hub there will be schools, but again, it will be very much in partnership with the voluntary and community sector and other public sector partners. So the whole area of partnership is very much at the heart of what we think is critical for delivering or thinking through and then delivering effective policy and practice in the long run to shift the dial on challenging social issues. And it's that partnership element that I think has informed quite strongly the IFG and Big Lottery program that we've developed, where we're trying to get people from the civil service plugged in and working with and talking to voluntary and community sector people at a local level, and to have the voluntary and community sector people also connected in the other way. And we think that those connections are not only good for personal development, but we think they're absolutely essential for effectively connecting policy with practice and making changes and making a real difference in the long run. And it was interesting because I met a few of you beforehand, and I asked the question of what was the high point and the low point. Nobody told me what the low point was, but maybe we'll come back to that. But one of the high points that I thought was very interesting was one of you from a charity said that actually when you get together and are talking with people from the civil service and government, it's surprisingly easy to have an influence. And in some ways that may be overly simplifying matters, but we do think that it's absolutely crucial to have these connection points, person by person, organization by organization, because that will create the effective and virtuous feedback loops that I think are critical for creating meaningful partnerships. I've been asked to talk a little bit about early learning from 2 of the strategic initiatives that you guys have been involved in. One is Talent Match, which is the program we have for getting young people furthest away from the job market onto and into employment. And the second was Multiple and Complex Needs. And I'll just share with you some of the early learning that Andrew Hudson and the team have provided. The first one is that developing local partnerships is hard work. It takes time, and it requires a lot of attention. And I think partly that's around the fact that when you're asking organizations that oftentimes compete and therefore are instinctively suspicious of each other to start collaborating, that does require a shift in mindset, and frankly, it's not something that happens one time and then it's done and we've reached a beautiful state. And we can come back and talk more about that. The second thing is that data collection and sharing of good quality data is a challenge. And when I mentioned the idea that we are going to have rigorous and independently evaluated activities with these initiatives, the agreement on what data to collect, how best to collect it to get good quality data while minimizing the sort of transactional costs of getting data, that is something that we're really together beginning to learn how that works and how to make that as efficient and effective as possible. So that's, those are two learnings, and again, we may want to come back to that and bring various people in. The program, just to say that, to finish up, it is really trying to think about and operate in ways that we think are different, that are in effect kind of grassroots, civil servants paired with voluntary community sector organizations, hopefully more widely paired with people from the private sector. Because we're talking here about sort of the bilateral connection with the public sector and the social sector. I think for a number of the areas we're looking at, the private sector is going to be a key partner as well. Certainly in talent match in local areas, that's been critical. But why don't we start with bilateral relations, and then we'll move on to trilateral, maybe after we've had a few drinks. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks very much, Nat. We're now going to move on to a real-life pair. You've heard it kind of described in sort of principle, so we've sort of captured and tamed for you. Amanda and Adrian. So Amanda is Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department of Business Innovation and Skills, which sounds quite terrifying. But when she started on the programme, she was working on apprenticeships, so right at the heart of some of the issues and the challenges we've been looking at around the big lottery investments. And Adrian spent most of his working life in learning and skills charities. So they're going to just talk through their experiences on the programme. So over to you, Adrian and Amanda.
Sorry, I've got some. It's magically happened. Good Lord. Anyway, sorry about that. So we're obviously here to tell you about our experience on the programme, but we wanted to just say a few words at the beginning about why we signed up and why connecting policy with practice was just something that just drew us in as something that instantly made sense to both of us.
Yeah, it was an attractive, if rather simplistic proposition, really, for a hard at heel kind of voluntary sector manager, in terms of that opportunity to get in the face of somebody that made those policies and actually get them out there and have a look at what it was really like at the coal face. So that's what I was interested in.
Sorry. Who's controlling what's actually showing on the screen? Because it should be showing something. Okay, great. Sorry. We had such a beautifully smooth. And as a policy official, I was very aware that my kind of much vaunted experience helping to deliver the apprenticeships programme was actually a really, really long way from that chalk face that Adrian mentioned. I think what was also important for us as a pair and how we worked as a pair and what made it a success for us was that we both came to the programme, I think, with a kind of shared commitment to personal and professional development through reflective practice.
Yeah, and what was also important was that, in just thinking about how these relationships work, going back to Nat's points, was about we needed to go through a process of developing some trust between us, which would enable us to really get to a point where we could abandon some of the potential prejudices that we were bringing to the debate that we were going to have. And we did find, I think, that we had some prejudices which we were able to unpick. So, moving on, we decided to focus upon commissioning. Commissioning, just a small aspect in the life of somebody in the voluntary sector. Why did we decide to do that? Well, we decided that commissioning was essentially one of the clutch plates where policy connects with practice. It's also one of the areas where, if the gears grind, then things can be quite messy, really. So it was that was what we decided to focus upon.
And we also had a shared interest in the impact of different approaches to commissioning, from the kind of hard-boiled, detailed approach where you specify every detail of the outcomes and the processes and the performance measures right from the outset, to a more open approach where there's room for flexibility and evolution along the way, but that's much more relationship-based. And so there's a kind of, you have to invest in kind of building those relationships and that trust to make that approach work.
So how did we go about it? Well, we set off on a journey, and we got to see around 10 organisations from London, Manchester and Cumbria, and largely we undertook face-to-face discussions with the individuals in those organisations. We'd like to move on now to tell you some stories. I hope you like stories, and these stories are going to really pull out what we think are the key learning aspects from each of our journeys. Monday.
So my story is summed up in 2 pictures, and the first one is this. This is a wildflower garden that I photographed outside the Broughton Trust in Manchester. And for me, I chose this picture because it symbolises the value of what small-scale voluntary sector organisations can really bring to these kind of complex social problems that we're talking about, communities and individuals and families with multiple needs. It's bright, it's diverse. In some sense, it represents creativity, flexibility, a certain amount of creative chaos perhaps, but also very much firmly rooted in the soil in which it's growing. And that's actually emblematic of the Broughton Trust itself, which is a community-based organisation. And Broughton is a pretty complex community. Diane, who was our wonderful host when we were up there, summed it up as 9 streets, 32 languages. You've got there's quite a big refugee population, which I think is what's partly adding to that Tower of Babel with 32 languages in such a small space. And you've also got some entrenched 3rd-generation joblessness quite high in that community. And what's special about the Broughton Trust is the way in which it's really tried to respond creatively to those very complex needs that you have in that community there. So over the years, they have delivered Sure Start programs, they've delivered community-based learning, they've delivered youth development, they've worked with sustainable communities. So from the policy perspective, that's kind of all over the shop, all sorts of different areas dealing with different sets of commissioners. But what makes sense from the Broughton Trust perspective is that each one of those is an attempt to meet the needs of the individuals, of the families, of that community that they're rooted in. So that's the Wildflower Garden, but this is the second picture. It's a recreation in my office of something that they showed me when I was there. So this symbolises my learning. When we were there, Diane pulled out an enormous lever arch file, which contained, I think it was 20 safeguarding policies that they'd had to develop, each of these obviously kind of complex multi-page documents, in order to be considered to deliver services for Salford Council. Now, that didn't look great, but when we talked about some of what was in those safeguarding policies, I could actually see that there was a point to some of them. For example, they'd had to deal with an incident where one of their youth workers had taken some young people on a trip, had a beer, and then got into a bit of an altercation with one of the lads on the trip. And it's the sort of thing where you probably can't prevent it, but having a bit of policy around it, a bit of clarity with the young people who are working with you would be helpful. So, okay, a lot of work, but could see why the council had asked for that. What was more distressing was when Diane pulled out 2 more lever arch files stuffed to the gills with papers. And she explained that what had happened was, in one of those kind of reorganisations that's actually meant to make everything simpler and easier and more tractable for service providers or would-be service providers, the 8 boroughs had got together into the Association of Greater Manchester, to produce a single commissioning framework. But from the Broughton Trust perspective, what that meant was they'd had to rewrite all of those safeguarding policies and then add in additional documentation around risk management, continuity plans, all sorts of things that if you're a tiny community-based organisation with, on a good day, 3 full-time members of staff, usually more like 1.5, that's a massive investment. Diane said it had taken them 3 months to complete that work. And I think, there are a couple of different lessons you could draw from it. With my policy head on, I was thinking, well, back in my home department, biz, we spent a lot of time thinking about better regulation, but typically thinking about it only from a private sector perspective, and maybe we should be thinking a bit harder about what we could do through a better regulation agenda for the voluntary sector. Some of it was about the asks that we make of the voluntary sector that we don't fund. So typically those kind of public sector stuff, we don't fund the core staff who have to produce this work. We don't provide investment when people are developing bids in these kind of complex frameworks, which is something that other funders do if you look at what the Tudor Trust does, if you look at what the lottery does. So the sort of lack of investment when we create these complex processes and the difficulty that creates for small organisations. But actually, the lesson that hit home the hardest, and which I think about whenever I see these massive piles of paper, is that what we seek when we go to the voluntary sector, that creativity, that diversity, that ability, if you trust them, to respond flexibly to complex needs that you can't sort of pre-specify in advance in some detailed service level agreement, that sometimes if we take the wrong approach to commissioning, we're actually destroying the very value that we seek to gain by going to the voluntary sector. So that was my lesson. Wildflower Garden, massive pile of papers. And Adrian now has a story from a different part of the country.
Thank you. Another lesson. So this lesson has a classic plot to it. See if this has got any resonance with you. So it's a classic plot line where there's 2 well-meaning friends, a miscommunication, nobody gets what they came for, and there's hilarious consequences. You've all seen those. You've all seen those films. This wasn't Hollywood, however. This was Deepen Cumbria. We'd identified one of our partners on the programme, the Braithwaite Trust organisation in Cumbria, as an organisation that's doing some fantastic work with young people in that area. And they were really, when we got up there and we spoke to them, they developed a methodology in terms of how they were working with young people. And that was really about getting underneath young people and really looking at the foundation stones of their attributes, which would enable them to progress in life. So rather than just thinking, let's deliver things which are going to get them, that are going to enhance their employability, get them a CV, etc. They were getting beneath all that and looking at core behaviours that would actually enable that young person in the long term to be able to replicate those more employable kind of attributes for the long term. So they were a fantastic organisation to go and visit. What we found out was that the organisation was managing a whole variety of contracts, which in a matrix kind of approach, they were managing all of those successfully and getting an awful lot of young people through their programmes. One of the contracts which we looked at was one which they had been given to deliver youth democracy services. So getting a group of young people to get engaged in democratic processes across the county. Cumbria being a very rural, large county, that involved quite a lot of challenges. The contract had the potential to be a really exciting and productive commission. It had the potential to focus on those real core behaviours which Braithwaite really felt as though they could impact upon. It had the potential to invest in a number of young people and develop their skills, but to really aspire and inspire other young people to get involved in youth democracy. The issue that we spotted and was talked about with passion by the staff at Braithwaite, however, was that, that the contract terms were written in such a way that the only way that the performance of Braithwaite would be monitored would be on the number of one-to-one interventions. So they would not be recorded for any group work activity, they wouldn't be recorded for any social media activity or anything at all outside of that. And despite many, many attempts to try and renegotiate the nature of that contract, it just wasn't possible. The computer says no, it's not going to happen. Now if you can think about trying to deliver a project which is about democracy, which is about people engaging with each other, probably you don't do democracy on your own, you've probably got to talk to other people, but the contract would only count one-to-one interventions. So, and you know, it's perhaps a silly example in some ways, but just using it really to illustrate that what we actually had at the end of that, in some ways, was everybody was happy, maybe, because the commissioner had their numbers. They got everything that they needed on paper. The provider had got their cash. They'd earned everything. They'd managed to achieve all of their ticks. That was all fine. But the young people had potentially missed out on the richest experience that they could possibly have had. A classic communication, but with not very hilarious consequences. Is this a tale of a nostalgic voluntary sector? Is this a tale of too much red tape? Or is this just reality? And if so, what lessons have we learned and can we learn from our experience?
So we've tried to draw out some messages from kind of policy-making perspective and the voluntary sector space in terms of what sort of questions should we be trying to ask ourselves in order to work together more effectively, bearing in mind the nature of both kinds of organisations and the kind of landscape of commissioning, which is never going to settle down for all time. And so from the policy-making side, I think the key question that policymakers need to ask themselves is, what are you actually going to the voluntary sector to provide in terms of that added value? Really understand that and don't lose sight of it. If you're looking for that creativity and that flexibility to respond to diverse needs on the ground, don't design a commissioning process that squeezes the life out of the organisations that you're going to for it. And be very aware of the nature of voluntary organisations. I mean, they have the power to kind of multiply your funds because they bring in those volunteers, but understand what brings in those volunteers is that organisation's mission and its values, and that's really there as an often implicit, sometimes explicit contract between the organisation and its volunteers. So you need to understand the nature of the organisation that you're dealing with and operate in a way that allows them to bring that added value. And you need to kind of design that into your programmes and your commissioning process.
And the flip side, the messages for voluntary sector organisations, and they really are the flip side of Amanda's points, really. Voluntary sector organisations absolutely need to know, and they need to be well versed in their own added value. What is it that they bring to any potential contracts, any potential commissions, which is about their community, is about that richness that they can bring over and above. Yes, we can achieve 100 of those or 200 of those. They really need to be aware and well versed in that additionality. Need to be very aware of how commissioners can support or undermine that value, and to actually have some real self-awareness in terms of where you will go and where you will not go, in order to not undermine your status with your constituents. And finally, once you've got that awareness, that self-awareness, and you've got that belief in yourself, then, and this is no surprise to any voluntary organisation here, then you really must make that clear to those that do commission you or may commission you in the future. Thank you very much indeed.
Lovely. We'll come to questions after the next input, so it'll be over to you then. So bear in mind questions, thoughts, responses to Nat and to Adrian and Amanda. Nicola Hughes, Senior Researcher at the Institute of Government, previously at Shelter and a host of rapidly moving early career choices. Nicola has run and managed the entire programme and is going to pull out the sort of patterns, the themes and some of the insights from the programme. So Nicola.
Thank you very much. So, as you've heard, I'm Nicola Hughes. I'm a senior researcher here, and it has been, I can honestly say, a pleasure to manage this programme over the last year. You've heard from one pair tonight. I want to give you more of an overview of the programme, how it worked, and what we found as a collective. So I'm going to talk about that, and then I want to talk about some conclusions that we found, and these are sort of themed around 5 major sort of disconnects, if you like, between policy and practice. So the programme seemed pretty simple. It was to connect people who make policy in Whitehall to people who deliver services on the ground in the voluntary sector, and vice versa. And to be honest with you, when I was applying for this job, I thought that was fairly simple. I worked in a charity myself at the time, and it was a real sort of bread and butter bit of my day job to be engaging with civil servants, to be in working groups, to respond to consultations, to help my colleagues in fundraising and services on getting government contracts. But the more I looked into this programme, I think the more I realised that what we were trying to create was actually quite a different type of conversation. So we were looking at a much more grown-up, ongoing conversation and dialogue between these two sectors. It was prompted by the big investments that Nat has spoken about. So these really interesting investments into NEETs, into multiple needs. We at the Institute thought that was a really interesting, different way of doing things and wanted to see what could be learned from that kind of policy that cuts across electoral cycles, that cuts across departmental silos. And the Institute as well had also found in our previous work, unsurprisingly, that policy making isn't this neat thing. It's not a document in Whitehall that gets implemented neatly on the ground. It's much more complicated than that. We'd also found through our work on public services that people who work in government, who deliver commissioned services, who make policy, we'd recommended that they needed to get out there, be on the ground and understand what was happening in those systems that they oversee. So this programme aimed to actually do that, to make that a reality and give it a bit of structure. So at the heart of the programme were the 30 people on the cohort. It's a little selection of them. So we paired them up, as you've seen. They did individual research projects, they went on exchanges, they went on visits, out into local communities and then back into Whitehall to learn from one another. They also came to group days here to share their thoughts and ideas. And we had them working across 3 sort of themes at the start of the programme, around service design, around funding and around collaboration. And we also had some other events to sort of supplement their findings. And often people did come with quite different perspectives. There were lots of debates, but what was really heartening to me, I think, is that every time we looked at what people spoke about, there was sort of one thing at the centre of it, and I like to do these after every event, a little wordle. And as you can see, they were very much focused on people and outcomes, and it was quite nice that although people had really different perspectives, they were sort of aiming towards the same goals. So due to logistical difficulties, we couldn't get all 30 of them up on stage, but I do have a wizzy invention to share a few more of their perspectives, which I hope works.
I'm Pat Russell. I work for the Department for Work and Pensions, and I've just been asked to reflect a little bit on what I've got out of the programme and what worked for me. I think there were 2 main things to reflect on. First and most importantly, it was really helpful to be able to take some time out of the day job and really focus in depth on one aspect of my work. And in this, I was looking with my partner at how do we actually look at service delivery on the ground. And one of the things that we ended up exploring in some detail was actually service user engagement. Now, I thought that we were quite good in the civil service about engaging service users. We did lots of focus groups and customer insight and consultations. But actually getting out there and talking to service users and looking at how some organisations have really made some inroads into helping service users become engaged. I think there's a lot more we can do in the civil service to bring that insight from end users into our policy making and indeed into service delivery.
Hi, my name's Nick O'Shea and I'm Director of Operations for Resolving Chaos. That's a not-for-profit organisation which looks at high-cost people service use and sees how we can improve their lives through different interventions. I've been part of the Connecting Policy and Practice Network for the last 9 months, and I've been paired with Tamsin Roberts, who's from the Cabinet Office. It's been a brilliant experience because I've been given the chance to think, to meet senior civil servants and to really talk through what are the big policy issues that they face and how they make policy go from a piece of paper through to the practice on the ground. And really what's been very interesting is to talk to people who actually just want the same outcomes that we do. We want services to be better, people's lives to be better, maybe those services to cost a little less money. This programme's given me the chance to talk directly to those people and to really work with them to show them the experience that I've had in the front line, match their policy experience and how we can make things better.
Ta-da. Lots of pairs, lots of different perspectives, and they had at our events what I believe is known as sort of diplomatic circles as lots of full and frank conversations. But what we tried to do at the end of the year, and you'll see in the reports which are outside, is to identify some of the more common themes, the things that sort of kept on coming up over and over again in all of their different projects. So I'm going to talk you through the 5 of these. The first is that people's lives are complicated, but policy often, not always, but often operates in silos. That people on the ground know that people with very serious problems, people with multiple complex needs, people far from the labour market, it takes a long time to fix their problems. Policy and funding don't always make that possible. They found that prevention can be valuable, but it's hard to do in a constrained funding environment. Fourthly, that policy often starts with good intentions, but they get lost as they get reinterpreted on the ground. And finally, that understanding and involving service users, from their point of view, starting with positive things, can be really a good way of achieving aims, but often policy discussion focuses on the negatives. So firstly then, people's lives are complicated and they need whole person support. And I'm going to be honest, at the start of this process, I always thought that sort of holistic services and whole person support was a bit one of those policy cliches that kind of gets bandied around a lot. But talking to the people on the programme, I really noticed that that's not true. You know, they were working with people who had lots of different problems. It sounds cliche, but it's absolutely true. And one of them told us a story about a 15-year-old girl that she'd helped. So this girl had been in and out of care, she had drink problems, she wasn't engaged at school, her future career path wasn't looking great. But she got onto a voluntary sector programme with this fabulous organisation who are involved in the programme called the Real Ideas Organisation down in Plymouth. She was doing well on this voluntary programme, and then all of a sudden she sort of disengaged and seemed to sort of not be into things anymore, was having some behavioural difficulties. And Real Ideas knew that that was because one of the other people on the programme had been someone that had actually been involved in a violent attack on this girl's boyfriend. So they managed to get her to engage back in the programme, to get involved again in this voluntary scheme. And I think the reason they could do that is because they had a long-term trusting relationship with her, and they were also collaborating with all the other people around this girl, all the different statutory agencies. And I think what that story shows is that, you know, one intervention just wouldn't have helped that girl. It wouldn't have been able to deal with the underlying issues. It wouldn't have been able to work around all those different problems in her life. So if you think of a job centre or a GP, it's just not set up in that way. It also shows, I think, that story, the importance on the ground of collaborating and of working with all these different agencies. As Nat mentioned, you know, one of the things that came out very clearly in this programme is how much collaboration and partnership really takes skill and it takes time. So we had some pretty horrific examples of people having just 4 weeks to put together £4 million bids and to form partnerships. Now, that's just quite impractical, but moreover, I think it squeezes out more innovative practices and smaller organisations. You can't bring those into partnerships if you don't have enough time to develop them. Policy can be good at cross-cutting and working on these whole-person issues, but I think when we think about the sort of traditional Whitehall structures and we think up to budgets, the autumn statement coming up next week, often departments are competing for bits of budgets and they're not working across on this sort of whole-person way. So that was the first disconnect. The second was around time. So people who have very complicated issues in their life, it can take a long time to work around those, a matter of years. They can go in and out of treatment, and the people that work with them have to be patient and they have to work hard. But what people found when they went to examine these issues on the ground was that changes to policy or changes to funding, which happened often, really frustrated some of those processes. So I think the example of the lever arch file is a good one. People are trying to do the right thing for their clients, but changes in direction make that very difficult for them. But I do think that the voluntary sector participants here could see that a lot of that was a political reality. Ministers will want to change a policy that's not going well. The fourth one that we identified was around prevention. So I think most people would agree that preventative services that stop problems from escalating at an early stage are a good thing. It was really interesting. We had a roundtable talking about young people who are out of employment, educational training, and what some people might term sort of stops and flows. So, of course, we need to help the people who are out of work now, but what about stopping people from becoming NEET in the first place? And one of the pair projects that I'm really excited about, they've actually developed a scheme to, they're calling it Through the School Gate, to help young people at an earlier stage, so to collaborate between the voluntary sector and schools to get in there and mentor young people so they don't leave school not sort of work ready. But, you know, prevention can often lose out to crisis funding, to sort of the more immediate help. And I think if you think back to the budgets and the way things are, the sort of mechanisms aren't quite there to do this preventative work. Another aspect, I think, of prevention is around costs and benefits, and some of our pairs looked into this. So some clients might use services like A&E, they can be very high cost. More preventative services that work with them and help them to avoid using those sorts of services can save a lot of money. Well, what they found was that actually no one's really responsible for tracking that data, for looking out for those people. So it's quite difficult to get to. And even if you can create a really good cost-benefit case, and again, this is where we have the silo problem. Different departments, different budgets. Does one department care if your cost now is going to cause another department cashable savings in 20 years' time? It's quite difficult politically, and it's quite difficult for local authorities as well. I think that's one of the things that the big lottery programs are trying to build a case around, which will be a really interesting one to watch out for. And the fourth one, policy often starts with good intentions. It seems fairly obvious, but it was quite striking, you know, as we went through the conversations on this program, that everyone in the systems is trying to do the right thing. You know, nobody starts a policy with a bad intention. And one example I had of this, I think, where the policy intention was pretty valid, but created some sort of weird, perverse incentives on the ground, was around statutory duties. So homelessness duty, mental health support, these things have statutory thresholds so that support goes to the most vulnerable people. That's a valid intention, you might think, but for people with multiple and complex needs, they might not be eligible for any one of those services, so their problems escalate if they can't get in and they get bounced around the system. So that policy is sort of getting misinterpreted and redone as it goes around on the ground, and it makes it much harder for local authorities, I think, to commission services that sit outside of those statutory duties or to do things a little bit differently. Finally, a disconnect that really struck us was around involving service users and really bringing out the positive parts of their lives. I think it's really interesting because behavioural insights, as I'm sure many of you know, has been used to great effect in government around things like tax. And that's sort of shown the importance of language and of framing, and I think that's really important in social policy as well. So if you call a service terrible, awful families or worst estates, it doesn't really start things, one of those is real, one of them's not. It doesn't really start things on the right footing. And one of our participants worked in the youth offending world, and he spoke a lot about how that world is full of language about risk and about danger. There's a valid policy intention there, which is community protection, but it tends to start things off on the wrong foot. So if a young person walks through the door, the first thing they're confronted with is a really long form telling them what they can't do, talking about their mental health problems, talking about the risk they might pose to a society. And it's only at the end of that form, when it gets to what they like to do, what they're interested in and what they like. And he talked us through some of the people that his organisation, Whiteboard in Leicester, have helped. And they've done that often by finding out what the person likes first. So one of the girls that came to them, history of violence, drinking, real problems. But they started out with, you know, what do you like to do? And have gradually built up her confidence and helped turn her life around. So those are some of the things that we have observed across the programme. I think for many of you who sort of work in public services or in policy, these are quite familiar sort of bits of discourse. The sorts of things we hear quite a lot, and they're quite fundamental problems. So I'm not going to say that we've got the answers to all of these right away, but we do think that, having observed this programme, that more dialogue, more feedback loops with the frontline is absolutely one of the things that can help. It can help people to pick up on sort of small problems like mad contracting procedures. And we'd like to see more of that, more policy schools, buddying, more structured programmes like this one, more action learning between the sectors. And I think that needs to be sort of incentivised and legitimised within the civil service. It's also sort of raised some quite big questions for us, this programme. So we hope that the big lottery programmes, they're going on for the next sort of 5 to 8 years, looking at a really different way of doing things can help to actually bridge the gap between some of these disconnects. It's also sort of prompted some questions for us at the IFG that I hope some of you might reflect on. So, if government wants to do more joined up whole person services, what are the mechanisms for that? How does it go about it? How can we make those sorts of things more like the norm and less like the exception? Is it possible for government to drive longer term policy? And if not, how can people on the ground sort of work around that? And if there's value in preventative services, then how do we fund that? How do we go about it? So those are some quite sort of open questions and big challenges. I just want to end by saying sort of thank you to the cohort and the people that participated who worked incredibly hard. And we'd really like to continue this work and help to sort of close up that gap between policy and practice. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much, Nicola. So now it's your turn. Interested in questions or points or challenges or clarifications? Been all the way through from Nat, Amanda, Adrian and Nicola. So over to you. I'll probably take questions in little groups and I might throw some of them back to you to sort of save some of the stress for the panel. So who would like to ask a question? Gentleman down the back there.
A question to Amanda. I get the impression you started this project in your previous role and have subsequently moved to as a deputy CSA. I was curious to know what lessons you've learned from this, which seems to be sort of quite focused on social policy, that might apply to your new role, which presumably is to do with sort of science policy.
Amanda.
Okay, not a little group. I'm the Deputy CSA for BIS, so actually trying to make sure that all the policy in the department is well supported by scientific, evidence-based information, and that would include where we intervene on adult skills, for example, so the department actually has some continuing responsibilities in this area. So it's not completely disconnected in terms of the kind of subject matter. I think there are also some kind of themes and approaches, because actually I think a lot of what I gained from working with Adrian and really going out on the ground was actually learning about dialogue, about reflecting on my own preconceptions, and really trying to understand what it's like for other people. So some of those some of that thematic stuff I think also just kind of carries over into my current day job.
Okay, more questions.
Rob Smith, Independent Policy Advisor, was a civil servant. I'm very interested in this kind of programme and had experience of Sure Start and community rehabilitation, etc. I suppose what worries and interests me about this is how far, it's very good for central government to see what goes on the ground, obviously, and to learn. But we're still wrestling, aren't we, with how prescriptive central government should be in terms of policy as to what happens on the ground, and how we get a balance between central government running off with best practice and saying this is the way for everyone to do it because we know it works, and recognising that that doesn't usually quite translate to the ground. So it's a good intentions thing, and I wasn't quite clear what people felt the job of local government was in this, standing between central government and perhaps local partnerships. And we've had so many of these programmes, but I feel we're still wrestling with some of these fundamental issues.
Would anyone else like to respond to that point in the audience?
My question was related, so perhaps if I make a point as part of it. I was very struck by what Nat said at the beginning about the importance of investing in local partnerships and making them more effective. And one of the roles I would see for central government, being a classic Whitehall type in this sense, is how is it we create the right conditions so that those partnerships can thrive? And so I wonder if there is any learning from participants or from Nicola from the overview of the programme about where central government does positive things to help create those conditions for effective partnerships, which are crucial to a lot of this.
A response to that from Jill, who's in the cohort herself.
Yes, thank you. I'm Jill Brown from Brighter Futures. I'm one of the participants on the course. And I think the question then is maybe to stand the whole thing on its head and say, is it for central government to dictate and direct policy, or is it for central government to begin to think very hard about how the best policy is made? And certainly, I think some of the things we've really thought very hard about on the programme are when services are co-produced, designed and delivered by the people who are, if you like, no longer consumers of public services, but actually active participants in the delivery of those. So it's about central government being in a position to set the grounds for the way in which policy is created rather than dictate that actual policy.
Adrian.
Yeah, just reflecting on building on that and the point about the role of local authorities really, and I think one of the things that we saw in a number of our visits was that there is quite often out there that the cutting red tape agenda from the government, as it doesn't seep through to local commissioners in the same way, where humanistic maybe tendencies take over, and there's much more controls put in place at a local level than actual policy would require, and I think it's the system stewardship approaches that IFG talks about, and how we actually engage with local policymakers and local commissioners to get them involved in more of this reflective practice, to see how the impact of their current practice actually doesn't add value but potentially detracts from the outcomes that they're seeking.
I was just going to make a point. Kat Drew, I work for the Home Office and I was a member of the civil servant cohort. And my point was we had lots of discussions about kind of how policy is made in government, and Nicola outlined kind of some of the more formal mechanisms that we have to engage with local service providers when we're developing policy. But I think one of the things that I really took from this programme was thinking about how I can create a much more informal network that I can quickly go out to using digital means to quickly test ideas as they're coming up, particularly when you have to make policy quite quickly, but make sure it's absolutely informed by the people who know the service users the best.
Nat, do you want to reflect on some of those points from your perspective outside the...
Well, yes, I do. And I think that your opening question, for me, is in a way encapsulates the challenge that we're going to be facing in the years to come. And that is, it's how to disseminate effective practice. And in another role that I'm involved in outside of Big Lottery Fund, it's with the Education Endowment Foundation, which was created with a pot of money from the department. And we're kind of in the early sort of exuberant stage of testing out ideas, and with lots of randomized control trials and everything else. And one of the things that's becoming clearer as we're going through this, and as some of the results are beginning to come through, is thinking about how complex the issue of dissemination is going to be. Because there are going to be a number of levers and stakeholders that you pull and have to engage with. And I don't think any of us know the answer yet, but the whole tension between knowledge and experience and valuable insight at a local level, either from users or local government, versus the central government's need, desire, and the role that's been defined up to now of control, and how that has to be reimagined and restructured. And that is, in many ways, when I think about the initiatives that Big Lottery is pursuing and this sort of thing, we're on it's trite and it's a bit cliched to say we're on a journey, but I do think that part of the reason for making a commitment to long-term programs is I think there's going to be a lot of kind of testing and learning and maneuvering that has to go on at the same time as some quite significant rethinking about the role of central versus local government and the role of users and civil servants and voluntary sector. So I think it's absolutely the right question or debate to have. I don't believe any of us at this stage can quite see it, but I think it's important to have the ability to experiment, the ability to work on a long-term basis, and I think the ability to hold the nerve of trying things out that oftentimes aren't going to work. And I think that's where not only government, but the voluntary sector and funders like ourselves often get spooked. We start to say, well, we really want to learn what does and doesn't work, but then when things come in and you find out what doesn't work, people get a little antsy about that. And I think it'll be important to hold our nerve in this.
Okay, down here, and then I'll come to you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Dominic Williamson. I'm the Chief Executive at Revolving Doors Agency. We're a charity that works around system change for people with multiple and complex needs who end up in the criminal justice system. My question, there's two parts to my question really, and I think they're connected, but I'm not quite sure how, so I'm just going to say it and see if it works. The first thing is that I think that they're mixed up with all of this. There's some really quite tricky political issues. And I think I was struck by, I think it's Nicola, when you talked about the homelessness legislation earlier on. There are some, there are lots of gatekeeping mechanisms built into our public services, which, as you say, are there designed in order to ensure that scarce resource goes to who society sees as the most deserving, if you like. But many of the people that we are talking about here often are not seen as the most deserving, and actually, in political terms, particularly at a local level, are often seen as the opposite of that. They're actually seen as people who are the problem rather than the solution. They're people who are often regarded as people who need to be excluded from communities, never mind included in them, and definitely not given priority for housing. So I think there are some really difficult political problems that policy making, if we're going to get policy making right, it's got to provide solutions to those difficult prioritisation of resource political decisions. And the other thing I wanted to link to that really was about the service user involvement side of things. And I wonder whether there could be a principle in government policy that the first thing you do when you're making a policy is you think about who's this supposed to benefit, and then you try and bring those people who are supposed to benefit into the decision making, into the design, because I think so much of the consult, particularly when you talk about these sort of groups, they don't get anywhere near design of policy, or they don't get anywhere near actually working alongside, and I think this process is obviously working in that direction. But I do wonder whether we would have ended up with a bedroom tax had we involved some of the people that might have been impacted on it with some thoughts.
Amanda, do you fancy responding on behalf of governments and politicians?
I couldn't possibly comment. No, I think the principle of involving users as early as possible is really important, and as early as possible should really mean right at the beginning. I should probably put my hand up and confess that one of the things I'm currently working on in my new job is around the use of learning technologies in further education. We've got a minister who's very keen on colleges upping their game in terms of how they use learning technology. I inherited the project. It was some way down the track. And we were probably about halfway through it. And no one had actually gone and talked to any of the young people. And it was a pretty fundamental disconnect, because one of the reasons actually for doing this project is that you've got a lot of young people in FE who are using online all the time. They're living their lives through their phones. And then you've got really creaky IT in the colleges. And so there's like a massive disconnect. And we were very fortunate to have a bright young person who came in to work on the project who actually went into FE colleges and started interviewing the young people. And what was really interesting was it both gave us policy content, it checked some of our assumptions, but it also was an incredible tool for changing people's mindsets. because we actually made a video of that and, you know, put it up on YouTube and all sorts of things. And actually, the impact of hearing that kind of direct voice from the users when you're actually kind of trying to bring people around to a new way of thinking was phenomenal. So sort of putting my hand up to kind of, I'm trying to reform myself, is what I suppose I'd say.
Before I come to the next question, anyone want to respond? Are there any risk-taking civil servants in the room who'd like to respond to the challenge of the politics and the interaction in the politics and the policy?
We're really uncomfortable talking about risk, aren't we?
I thought I'd ask. There you are. That's the riskiest civil servant I know. Go on, Paul.
I'd slightly duck the politics part, but pick up actually the point about service design, and I think that's the most powerful way into some of this, because I think the more as civil servants we are able to evidence and demonstrate some of the realities of any policy, the more one can address some of those difficult political tensions. And so I think actually that's perhaps the way the question links. I think there's a lot of positive in relation to the work around open policy making and the new government digital service model around kind of seeing policy development much more as service development. And I think the more we can embrace that as a civil service, I think that will help us. And the other thing I'd say is I think we need to find a way of getting permission to fail. And I think this is, and it's not the politicians' fault in this sense, I think we need to think about this as a society as a whole in terms of how we create the conditions where it's okay that we try some stuff and prototype and allow that to happen. And actually working on a smaller scale with local partnerships is probably going to be one of the safer ways in which we can do that. So I think that's part of it. The other challenge I'd say is we, as Whitehall, we often put barriers in the way of doing some of that. And area I work in, we've recently been basically prototyping a digital concept court in Birmingham, and of course that broke all of the rules around what we were allowed to spend money on in business case terms and so on, and we have to push kind of the boundaries on how we do that. I think that's part of the way in which we do it.
Okay, very patient. Question down here.
Hi there, Jonathan Schiffers. I work on public services at the RSA. I wondered if we could hear a little bit more about the relative difference between policy areas, and I'm loath to call them policy areas because maybe that kind of concept is part of the problem in connecting policy and practice. Voluntary community sector organisations might call them just issues. But are there any particular issues, let's say, that are already doing this really well, connecting policy and practice? Education, homelessness, early years, community development, and are there any where it's particularly, you see it as particularly challenging or particularly difficult or promising, desirable, etc.? What's the difference between policy areas?
Go on then, Nicola.
Well, that's quite a tough one. I mean, I think this is one of the areas where what the Big Lottery Fund are doing is actually really exciting, because what they have done is essentially, and I don't want to go really into depth on your funding model, but what they've done is sort of found local areas, identified a need there, and then given local partnerships time to sort of build up a business case, to build up a way of doing things, and they've been involving service users the whole way through that. So I think by involving service users at that kind of design stage and in their business planning, they've picked up areas that might not be, education or employment, but the other things that come around those. So it was quite striking. I think some of the people that were working on young people who were out to work or training, when they did their sort of co-production and co-design processes, found that, some of the people they wanted to reach the most also had mental health problems or came from minority ethnic backgrounds, and that they could use their partnerships and use their programs to help, on those sort of wider issues as well. So definitely keep an eye on those investments and how they unfold as a way of looking at that. Anybody
else got any examples or grounds for encouragement to give that question? Adrian?
At the risk of just celebrating the lottery, I haven't got any applications ongoing at the moment, so there's no real risk there. But the ethos of the talent match programme, which was at the start of what we were talking about today, there's some really interesting elements in that to me, fundamental elements in terms of explicit words and explicit actions around talent match being inclusive of how organisations develop, not just about how the individuals that benefit from those organisations will develop. And I think that's a really interesting area of practice in terms how much that's acknowledged and seen as the responsibility or a shared responsibility between the funder, the commissioner and that organisation. And so that's an area which I think is an excellent example of where things could be moving to. I think that would be incredibly productive.
Time for one or two last questions.
Hi, my name's Brendan Whitty. I'm a PhD student at the moment. There's just a reflection really on some of the experience from the international development sector, where participatory development and participatory evaluation of programs so really kicked off in the 80s and the 90s. And one of the things that the sector found very difficult was to overcome the power dynamics, and systematically the case, an event between the sort of international agencies and those communities with whom they were working. I think it would be very interesting to see whether this sort of development here in the UK can overcome the challenges that we saw in the development sector. And to a large degree, that sort of paradigm, that discourse has been moved on for the last 10 years or so.
Anyone else with the last point or question? Or your stomach's rumbling at the thought of our glorious canapes. Nat, any final reflection from you before I ask for two last contributions?
Just two comments to pick up on that last comment you made. I do think the power dynamic between funders or policymakers and communities and organizations is absolutely crucial. And it's, again, one of our hopes is that with long-term programs and multiple partnerships, we will be able to build the relationship and the dialogue that reduces the discrepancy in the power dynamic. It'll never eliminate it. And the other related point, which is with these 5 initiatives, aside from the initiatives themselves, we're going to have 50 plus partnerships in operation, and I would hope there'd be a huge amount of learning as we move through that as to how to create what a good partnership looks like and the rules of road for that, because I think that is going to become increasingly important if we buy into the notion that cross-sectoral collaboration is going to be key. So.
Yes. Do we have a mic? Yeah.
Hi. Ruth McElmoyle. I work for the Department of Health. As a civil servant, what is the best way to engage with third sector organisations when you sometimes get the impression that all they're really interested in is funding, especially when you have no funds to distribute?
That sounds like a
great question.
I'm looking to the voluntary sector side of the cohort to respond to that one. Who'd like to have a go?
Come on, a program like this.
Amanda, we love you. Anybody else want to respond to that? Amanda, yeah?
If I were in your position, taking that people power change element of it, I'd actually directly find a way in which we can get directly to service users and use that as a lever. Because you sit in a position of relative power to be able to go into a GP surgery or elsewhere and actually, I suppose, create a different context for your policy thinking by going directly there. And I think using that, which is brave, I think you have to be brave in that, but I think that opens up an opportunity for you to then have a different kind of dialogue where you're being authentic about the desire to understand need, and therefore you change the dynamic about whether it's about service, need and funding, but it's actually understanding what happens on the coal face as a starting point.
Before we finally break, Stephen Aldridge is, for those of you who don't know him, long-time head of the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, but that doesn't make him a bad person. And also somebody who's very active in sort of cutting-edge thinking about doing policy making differently, very actively involved in the thinking development around the what works hubs, etc. So, Stephen, some reflections from your kind of your perspective. You take the mic.
Okay. Right. Look, thank you very much. I'll be brief. I think it's been a terrific and fascinating evening. Great presentations. Great discussion. I don't have time to pick up all the points, but I must admit, I really like the 5 fundamental disconnects that Nicola outlined, and I thought I'd just offer a few brief reflections on each as a way into the points that you've made, Peter. The first disconnect refers to the importance of whole person approaches rather than silos. And what I just wanted to sort of say, there's three points I just wanted quickly to say on that. The first thing that I've learned in terms of driving more joined up approaches is important of addressing things on the demand side rather than the supply side. And in that context, therefore, the emphasis in the discussion on user voice and empowering users is really, really important. And I think policy approaches such as community budgets, personal budgets, are actually entirely aligned with that conclusion. There is, of course, no time to elaborate on this, a question at what level you make use of those demand-side approaches. Do you devolve responsibility right down to the individual, or do you rely on collective institutions such as local government? I also, under this heading, just wanted to sort of make a point in reference to the comment about the bedroom subsidy, that when we talk about whole persons, we need to be clear which whole persons we're talking about, because in the case of the bedroom subsidy, according to polling, most people are actually very supportive of the welfare reforms. So if you look at the whole person who is paying for the benefits rather than receiving them, we may get a rather different policy response. So which people, which persons, is a really important issue here. The second disconnect was around the lack of long-term thinking, lack of long-term policy solutions. I think the absence of such thinking comes through very powerfully in the new book by Tony King and Ivor Crew on the blunders of our governments, which emphasises, amongst other things, the importance of more policy deliberation. It's also something that comes out from some of the IFG's work on successful policy. The case study that the IFG did, for example, on the work of the Pensions Commission and the pensions reforms, which showed how a really rigorous analysis of the issue, getting people to buy into the problem, and then when that's accepted, coming forward with solutions, shows that we can make long-term policy and we can get people to buy into it. I think there's something really important here about the role of institutional change. I think the what work centres are important because they potentially raise the political costs of non-evidence-based, non-long-termist solutions. I would also just wanted to challenge, though, there was a reference in the report to the problem of policy chopping and changing. You could say that actually we don't chop and change enough. We don't do enough experimentation. We don't rely enough on trial and error. Maybe we should be more willing to experiment, and when things don't work, admit it, stop it, and change. I guess the problem is that we carry on doing the wrong things for too long and never allow enough time to make the promising ideas flourish. There's also reference to proving, in terms of the third disconnect, being able to prove the benefits of interventions. I'm sure that's must do better in that respect, but we can never ever prove anything. Never prove in public policy that something will definitely work. But there's some really important issues around being better able to learn from others. As I've already said, willingness to experiment and pilot. Nat made reference to the importance of better data sharing. I'm sure that's absolutely crucial to getting a better handle on who we should target and what is working. The fourth disconnect emphasised the importance of understanding systems. I'm sure that's absolutely right. Whitehall needs to be better at systems thinking, designing systems, and there's probably a skills gap there that needs to be addressed. And then there was the fifth disconnect around failure of policymakers to incorporate the voices of users into policy design. Totally agree with that. My challenge would be, is voice alone enough? What about the empowerment of users, giving them the ability to exit when things aren't working, to exercise choices, or have people exit from things that aren't working on their behalf. The only final thing I wanted to add was that I think in relation to all these issues, there's a great deal that can be learned from the DCLG's Troubled Families programme, but I don't have time to say more.
Lovely, thanks very much, Stephen. And finally to Domendra, who was the driving force behind creating this partnership. Domendra, your reflections on the final word.
Firstly, just to say that at the heart of this programme lies an intellectual inquiry, which is really about, if you were to take a helicopter view of our system and looked at the ebbs and flow of need and the supply of services, would you design it that way? And what we tried to do was try and think about that helicopter view through the vertical axis of youth unemployment and adults with multiple complex needs. And I suppose a year is not long enough to answer that question, but I hope that what we've done is opened up a rich seam of dialogue between those who are involved in the supply of those services and those who are involved in the delivery of those services. And I hope that what we've been able to do in partnership with the Institute for Government is create a space for thought development in a serious way, because often I think what we don't do is take time out from the space of delivery or design and actually come together through different vantage points and perhaps give a 360-degree appraisal of that design process and impact process. And I hope that what we've tried to do in the past year with you is to create that, open up the seam, create the space. And I suppose lastly, I really do hope that what we've done is create a coalition of the willing to engage in that critical and intellectual inquiry about how you design policy differently better, so that actually you're more reflective of the future rather than the past. Because one of the things that Nat was saying is that what we did as a funder 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, was say actually things are changing and shifting so fundamentally that as a funder we ought to think differently about how we behave and what change we seed. And we took that helicopter view and thought, actually, how could we add value by taking that long term, by actually creating a different dynamic for change at a local level. But we scratched our heads in terms of actually, if we want to really leave a change in policy development, we really needed to partner with somebody that has influence in government, but is able to create the context, open up that seam and that space for policy deliberation. So I thank you for that partnership and pulling together the cohort that we have. I hope you as a cohort stay in touch with each other because I think that coalition of the willing is important, because the question we're addressing is not a one-day wonder or a one-hit wonder. It'll take time, but through your experiences, your conversations and relationships that I'm sure you'll continue will seed a different mindset, I hope, within in your network of influences, wherever you sit, to be able to perhaps ask the question that you did, actually, how can I think differently about taking a user perspective? So that's what we were hoping to do, and I think that's what the programme's enabled us, as in partnership, but with you as a cohort, to really think about and seriously wonder, actually, can you reimagine a different type of system underscored by people-powered change? So thank you very much. We've really enjoyed our time. Our investments are over the next 8 years, and I'm sure those of you who've been engaged in it will continue to peer in, but also actively engage in the learning, so that we can really tip the balance towards preventative-based policy making.
Great, thank you all very much, and thank you to the cohort, and thank you to the panel.